Welcome everyone to this webinar. It's been we've been planning to do this for a while. The main reason for this webinar is that we've come to realize that the community doesn't know our own history very well. Even I didn't know my own history. My parents don't know our history. So when Kitu and I were in Mangalore, we talked about it to Dr. Michael. And then we realized we have a lot of history. There's a lot of sacrifices from our ancestors, from our parents. But then the generation now and our children know very little about it. So we wanted to, do something about it. And we thought about discussing our history with the experts who have written a lot about it and who are very interested in it. And we wanted to talk in brief about, our genesis in Goa, the migration to South Canara, and the exile, subsequent exile, and then the return back to Canara. So, and then we've seen a lot of work being done from people like Michael about genealogy. And then we also wanted to understand, where did our culture come from? There are a lot of habits that we acquire from our parents. Where did these habits or where did these cultures come from? So that was the intention of the webinar. If for all the attendees out there, I thank you for joining the webinar. On the bottom, you will see Q&A. So you could ask a Q&A directly, questions to the experts, that is Alan or Michael, or you can chat with the panelists out there. Those are the two things you have. So I'm going to head it over to Kitu, and he's going to introduce the experts on this webinar.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, to wherever you are. I'm based in New York, so it's a little early for me, but I see on the attendees a lot of people from all over the world. I'm even from the west coast of the state, so that's great to have a strong audience here. We're very excited. So I won't spend too much time on our intros. Viju is my cousin based in Mangalore. I'm based in this state. I spent a lot of time in Mangalore earlier this year, and there met Michael and then got connected to Alan and some of the other panelists. So very excited to get this going. So just to kick off, we have five, I'd say, eminent personalities, certainly relative to Viju and I, on the panel today. I will kick off very quickly by introducing Alan and Michael. Viju will introduce the rest of the panel, and then we'll get started with the webinar in terms of content. So Alan Machado and Viju, maybe you are pulling up the slides or no?
Yeah, I'm pulling up the slides right now.
So Alan does not need an introduction to most Mangaloreans, and Alan is actually similar to Mike. He's done a lot of work on art history. He's written 3 books and has more in process. Over the course of the webinar here, we'll ask Alan to reference some of this work that he's done. I personally read one and then going through the other, and I would highly recommend recommend it for anyone interested in our community and where we came from and where we're probably going. Alan's based in Bangalore right now, and all of you should of the presentation in a little bit. And then Michael Lobo also similarly does not need an introduction to most of it. Michael has done a lot of, especially on the genealogy side. And this year in Mangalore, I had a similar experience where in Kiran Church, I came across my grandparents' birth record going back to the early 1900s in a big book that was in Latin. So it was a really interesting experience to be able to see all that. Michael started similarly doing some work on his own family many years ago, and so then has really cataloged a lot of our history in some very voluminous books, very detailed. It's been I guess for both of these experts, Alan and Michael, it's really been an exercise of the heart to get them here. So Michael as well will reference some of his materials. I see some questions, Michael and Alan, I see some questions on the chat about your book and where people can get them. So maybe towards the end of the webinar, we'll talk about that as well. I'd say I read one of Michael's books, this year. One of Alan's books in this year, and that's where this interest started for a lot of us. So with that, let me hand it back to Vijay to introduce the rest of the panel, and we'll get started with.
So we were excited to have Maxwell Pereira. Maxwell has written very interesting books, and when I spoke to him, I realized that he's writing much more articles on our history as well. So Maxwell, has been in the IPS, Superintendent of Police, and then he's almost has retired as the Joint Commissioner of Police in New Delhi. So he's written interesting articles along with his books. You can see these articles, some of the notable articles: Cordial Cuisine, the Family Chronicles, the Nickname Legacy, the Konkani Heritage, I'm a Hindu, and so on. And we wanted to get a very new perspective on our, on our history from, from different people, and that's why Maxwell would bring in a new perspective to this webinar. So Dr. Mona out there, when I met Dr. Mona, I was interested to know a lot about our heritage in heritage homes as well. And I was excited to see that she's doing a recent work on heritage homes in Mangalore. But other than that, she's been, a lecturer in Carmel College, Bantwal, the member of the Church History Association of India. Her articles have been on the women missionaries and their contribution to the social change in coastal Karnataka, Vovio, Konkani folk songs, the reflection of the Konkani Christian culture, history of the Mangalorean Catholic community. So, and she's also been an anchor on the IG as well. And, so it is a very interesting perspective on the contribution on women to our culture and to the community as well. Desmond out there, we were excited when Michael recommended that have Desmond, into the panel. Desmond is in Goa, and a new perspective to this as well. So Desmond, the founder of Agave India. So then if you see the work he's doing on that front is, on not on probably our history, but on our culture, these contributions are significant. So apart from his, a lot of travel experiences, he's been in BTech from IIT Madras. There is film and TV productions from Philadelphia, USA, back in India in 2000. Since then, he's made some productions on the souls and spices, which we will try to bring it out with Desmond's help to our YouTube channel that will come out. And then he is co-director and co-produced a 13-part TV series in Portuguese about our history as well, which we will try to bring it out as well. So these are the panelists there. I'm now going to hand it over to Kitu, and then we'll quickly run through the timelines of our history, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah. So, actually, Alan is going to run through the timeline. I will just give a quick flow of the webinar here and walk through the major portions that we'll try to cover in the next hour or so. So as some of you know, Alan will go through a synopsis of the timeline, which will start from our origins to how we landed in Goa, and then talk about, so there are 5 phases. I'd say the first one is that one, the phase of landing in Goa. The next one is the period in Goa through the Portuguese rule, where our community in some senses had its identity transformed. And then the third phase is the migration to South Canada. The fourth phase is the captivity period, which I wasn't very familiar with at all until a few months ago. And then the next phase is, I'd say, the post-captivity to today. So each of these will try to keep a module, it's flexible, we'll try to keep a module of 10 to 12 minutes each, so that runs about an hour. Feel free to ask questions along the way. There are you can ask questions in the Q&A bucket or the chat bucket, and Vijay and I will try to moderate and insert them where we can, and we'll try to keep it interactive with everybody on the Q&A. I see more than 200 participants already. This is very exciting to have that group up. So why don't I hand it over to Alan, to give us a brief synopsis. Alan, maybe in five minutes or so. Michael will add a couple of comments at the end, and then we'll get started with some Q&A.
Thank you, Keith. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I'll get straight to the topic. There is a saying that unless we know who we are, we cannot know who we are unless we know who we were. And unless we know who we were, we will never know who we are. In other words, we will never have an identity. And without an identity, it's very difficult to stand in the world today. So I would like to start by saying that we Mangalorean Catholics, most of us, the majority of us, the overwhelming majority of us have a Goan origin. Therefore, we need to start in Goa. Now, there is a lot of recent work being done on the genetic profile. And for the west coast of India, one of these studies showed a genetic profile, something like this, in other words, all humans come from Africa, and there is a small percentage still there, about 5%, and then about which dates back to 65,000 years ago, and then around 30,000 years ago we have got another hunter-gatherer populations coming in, HLR. Then the farming populations coming from West Asia, which is J2, which is about 13% of the population, and I belong to that group, a haplogroup. And then finally we have what is today identified with the Vedic cultures, that's the R1A, which came in from Central Asia, which is very recent, just about 4 to 3,000 years back. These people, these populations are still found in Goa. And the reason why I bring this up is that among the Gaonkars or the Catholic populations, quite a bit of people have done a bit of their own genetic studies, with 23andMe and other things. And an analysis showed that they all have different haplogroups. So even the Brahmins come from different haplogroups. So the Catholics themselves are composed of a vast number of these, H, L, R2, J2, R1. So there's no homogeneous aspect to this. Now the Brahmin populations, whom a lot of us attributed our histories, in the sense that is the most literate population that we have. And usually it is these literate populations that write our histories. So the histories that we have been reading so far, hardly anything has come from the other people, the underprivileged people. And this needs to come out to make our history more complete. Now the Brahmins came from different regions, Bihar, Gangetic region, Saurashtra, Kashmir and other places. So they all have different groups as such. It is difficult to attribute Goan history and therefore our history just to one particular group. Again, Goa was ruled by different rulers, and so each of them bring their own thing, and that is where the Brahmin population started coming in. Now from about 1510, around 1510 is when Goa came under the Portuguese, and they faced a big issue, in the sense that they tried to homogenize a population and create a new identity for a population based on something that they had achieved in Portugal itself a little while earlier, in integrating the Jewish and a large Jewish and Muslim population that they had. The same thing happened in Spain. They had some forcibly converted the Jews into Christians, and the Muslims populations they had were all expelled, or they left for North Africa. In this process, they made a sort of try to make a homogeneous population in Portugal, and many of the converts were called New Christians. When Portugal came into Goa, they were faced with the problem of a very large population, which was of very different groups, and they started working towards building what they call Portuguese nation, which would unify all these different groups from all over the world. This process was done through the process of conversion. Now, the policy was the government policy, the king's policy, the court's policy. The instrument that was used was the church, because of the religion. And through this policy, it meant not just a religious conversion, but also a social conversion, in which certain cultural aspects that were there in Goa I mean in Portugal, came down, like our identities with names, with dress, with cuisine as well, with the pork and beef coming into the picture. This conversion occurred in more or less three major phases. At the pre-1540 stage, which was a relatively open phase in which it was intended that people would join in, that now we had these new rulers. It was not very successful. But then from about 1540 to about 1580, a new policy was sort of introduced, and this was called the rigor de misericordia, or the application of moral force. There was no physical force at all, but there were a lot of coercive laws that were introduced by which, privileges were given if you converted, and so this helped to gain some, quite a large percentage of the population became Christian. Then from 1580s, that's when Portugal came under the Spanish ruler. It was a process of consolidation in which the converts were made into a more firm Catholics and an imposition, and there the Inquisition played a bit of part. But I would like to say that what stories have been told about the Inquisition, the narratives, are very, very different from reality. And this I can very confidently say, because my next book, after the history one which is under publication, would be on the Goa Inquisition. And the narrative is very, very different from what has been promoted in English accounts and also in India itself, by certain groups. Now, what happened was that these new policies introduced a lot of social unrest, which you can imagine, and ultimately people who could not accept this, that is I prefer to use the word gentios or Brahmins. The Portuguese never used the word Hindu. Hindu, the name has come only recently, with the coming of from about the late 19th century. So these Brahmins, who had the social privileged class earlier, made a strong opposition. Some of them opposed these policies, and it is these who were expelled. There were a few, not many, around the 1560s onwards, in small batches, and it was done quite discreetly so that there was no further unrest. Now, the Christians emigrated from Goa for different reasons, and these happened from about in three major phases, as you can see, and the causes were very, very different. The reason was by the time of these conversions had taken place, a lot of the agricultural lands, what are called the gaonkaris, which were controlled, had all come into Christian hands. And when, from about 1600 onwards, there were a lot of problems Goa faced from the Dutch first, and then from the Marathas in the second half of the 17th century. And this created a lot of disruption to the economy and forced people out. And the major, that is why, you find among Mangaloreans, a lot of, in the earlier days, the Christians were with an agricultural background, and this is why Monty Saibniche Fest became so important for us. And these migrations took place in phases. The first is around the 1570s when Bijapur had attacked. There was about a 10-year confrontation with Bijapur, and especially in southern part, in Kunkuli and Asolna, those parts of Salsette, there was a lot of opposition, and there are very good narratives on why that was there. Many of people from Salsette emigrated, and most of that was towards Kundapur and other areas. From about the mid-17th century till about the mid-18th century, that is almost about 100 years, there were major migrations because of the Maratha invasions. And these Maratha invasions was periodically. The earliest was around 1667 when the first Shivaji first attacked Bardez for different reasons. Then in 1684, there was a major problem when his son Sambhaji had almost reached the gates of old Goa. He had taken the Zoe, and Goa was just across a small creek. But then this set off a lot of Christians off, especially from Bardez coming to Mangalore. And you find Father Joswas coming around in 1681 to look after some of these. A little later, from about 1720 to 1740, you had intensified pressure, especially towards the northern part, Bombay and these areas which is called the province of the north, which is about 60-kilometer stretch there. And the Marathas took that, but that was under the Peshwas. But they also attacked, and Margao and all these places were captured. And Goa had to pay a very heavy price to recover their territories. And that price eventually came on the Christians to pay up, because, and the churches, of course, converted their silver and sold that and other things. Plus, a lot of Brahmins also had made contributions to pay the Marathas. Now, that set off a lot of migrations again to Mangalore. Now, when you look at where these migrants came into Mangalore, you see the first settlements came where they were in 1568, 1569. The Portuguese had got some small presences. When you say Portuguese, many people say the Portuguese captured Mangalore. That's not quite correct, because the Mangalore that they called was really in Bolar, and it was just hardly about 5 square kilometers. And there was a small fort. And so these were the areas where the Christians first started coming. So you see a small Christian presence starting by about 1600. You got about 1,000 more or less Christians of Goan origin settled in Canara. Then by about the middle of the century, it has come up to about 6,000 or so. And this is from a statistic that is given by a missionary priest from the Propaganda Fide who had visited. By 1671, 1681, the numbers start increasing, because these are the areas when the Maratha invasion start intensifying, and a lot of these people start coming in. And what you see is that by around 1700, beginning of 1700, there are already about 21 churches in Mangalore. In Honavar, there are 3, in Kundapur, 5, in Mulki, 4, in Mangalore, 9. These were the 4 vados in which the people were there. And by 1722, the population has grown. By 1784, because from, due to the second wave of Maratha problems, this population has climbed to about 50,000. There are 40,000 of them are in Canara, and about another 10,000 were taken by Hyder Ali into his army and garrisoned all over Mysore and other parts of his realm. And this population has climbed up to about 50,000. So what you have now is about, and the other interesting thing is that while this is going on, the Goa's population has remained practically static for the full century, just around 180,000. So if you take this combined population, you'll find that the Mangalore or the Canara region contributed practically 20%, practically 20% of the combined Goa and Mangalore Christian population. So 1784 brings us to the captivity.
Alan, let me pause you there, because let's pick up the captivity a little later, because I think there was a lot of information that came out there.
Exactly, that's what I was just about to say, and I was going to hand it over to for the next topic.
Yeah, and I see some questions that are quite interesting as well, so maybe we'll make this a little more interactive. Maybe before we do that, Michael, was there something you wanted to add to that phase of our history, like the phase that got us to Mangalore?
Okay, I'll just make 2 points. First, thank you, Vijay and Keith, for inviting me. It's my first experience of something of the kind, and it's very nice to see all the other panelists. 20 years ago, we had a major celebration to mark 200 years since our community, our forefathers were released from the Seringapatam captivity. I still feel that is the most important event in our history. And on that occasion, Alan Machado, Maxwell Pereira, and Desmond, we all got together with others to mark it in a big way. This year, 20 years have passed, and it's another very important anniversary. It's 175 years since Mangalore became independent of Goa as a diocese. Goa was under the Portuguese Padroada, not under Rome. And Mangalore, the leaders of our community had quite a struggle to make Mangalore an independent vicariate and diocese directly under Rome. That was in 1845. So this marks 175 years. So we've got together on two very important jubilees. And these are just landmarks in the history of Mangalore, which is so colorful in so many different ways, right from the Saraswat ancestral era, the conversion in Goa in the 16th century, the migrations to Mangalore in the 17th and 18th, the captivity by Tippu in the late 18th century, the British era in the 19th, which influenced us in so many different ways, our language, our cuisine, and finally the area of independent India. All these eras have seen so many profound changes that it's very difficult to do justice to them in one webinar. But I think we'll try and do it in the form of questions and answers, and I'll be happy to contribute in whatever way I can. Thank you.
Okay, that's an interesting anecdote, Michael. So that would be 1845, right? So that's post-captivity when we returned.
Yes. Today is the 175th anniversary, not today, this year.
Okay.
This month rather. It happened in November 1845 that the first bishop was brought in a sailing ship to Mangalore, but in a sailing ship actually constructed by a family of Mangalore, the Quellos of Falnir. They went all the way to Cochin, escorted him, brought him back to Mangalore, and he said a mass at Rosario Cathedral on the 8th of November in the year 1845.
Okay, so, very nice.
So maybe on this topic, just on the topic of our growth into Mangalore, Alan and Michael, there are a couple of questions which could be interesting. Alan, you addressed one of these. Very, very quickly, I'll ask. I think it's coming from, I don't know who is it coming from, but someone apparently on the audience here has done a DNA scan and traces some origins back to Kashmir. And Alan, what's your thought on that? I think that connects with some of the things you said in terms of our early origins into Goa, right?
I would like to know, you see, it's not that simple. The tracing these origins to Kashmir would mean that you would have to have a lot more DNA from Kashmir for which you can compare. So it's not just a haplogroup, but the entire chromosome. We have 23 chromosomes from a paternal side and 23 from a maternal side. So it really requires to be seen a little more in detail. And I would be interested to get in touch with this person, Keith. If you can put us in touch, you know, we could work on it and come up with something more detailed in the following thing on YouTube, you know.
Okay.
I think this is just an introductory thing where we're getting in touch so that then we can pursue it further.
Okay, so I'll at the end of this webinar, to whoever asked that question, we'll talk about some of the how to kind of continue the conversations. The next question on this topic, Alan, that was fairly interesting was around our names and whether by the time we came to Mangalore, and Michael will have a good sense of this as well, were we already baptized, as it were? Were we already having names or Portuguese names, or how were we?
Yes. Yes, certainly. I'll give you a little interesting thing about these names. You know, there was the Gavankari, that is the village community, the agriculture community of Aldona. There is a record, a 10-year record from 1595 to 1605. I belong to that, I think, because there is one, and that was not Machado, that was Macedo at that time. But what is interesting is many of them record their names there, and against the Christian name, they have the record also lists parents' gentile name, you know, if you want to say Hindu name as such. And in these groups, I found at least 3 manual Pintos from totally different families. So these names, I don't know how they were picked up, but they apparently were picked up at random and given, or maybe the viceroy or the godfather or something like that. So we were definitely converted by the time we came to Mangalore. There were a few converts in Canara region. Of course, there were a few. And these are the histories that we know very little about. For instance, Shastri writes that of a lady, of a widow, who was converted and took the name of Anadi, something, I can't remember exactly. And there was a Mahant, Shankara, who became something else. And completely Portuguese name. So the names were taken, but we remembered our pre-conversion names. That is why I know we are Prabhu.
Okay, that's great. That's great. And Michael, this ties into some of your work that you've been doing as well in terms of the genealogy. Maybe here I'll open it up to the panel as well. There might be a question or two from Desmond or Mona. Maybe Mona, you were your hand up for a question there?
Yes, yes. So, Alan, as you were talking about the waves of migration, which happened in 3 phases. One is definitely during 1571, the period of Inquisition, later followed by 1683 with the attack of Shambhaji, and then later on in the year 1739 with Baji Rao. I just want to know, as the group migrated towards south, was it only the agriculture, the skill which they knew, or did they have any other primary skills which they came with?
You see, Mona, the thing is, one, you brought in the word Inquisition, so I'll correct that. I don't think the Inquisition really played a role in migrations. I have not seen much about it as such as yet. The real reason for this migration is because of the economic problems that happened in Goa during this time. And this forced people out. In fact, in Bardez, from which a large percentage of our Mangalore Catholics come from, Bardez, a government report mentions and says very clearly that Bardez could not grow enough food to feed its population for more than 4 months in a year. This rice was brought largely from Canara, and there used to be convoys of boats. In one case, an English Dr. Fryer, who wrote a book, mentions crossing the Portuguese Armada. That means they had the Armada of the South, accompanying 200 small boats carrying rice to Goa. And there used to be at least 3 or 4 of these sort of convoys every year. So obviously, for people who don't have food and don't have security because of invasions, they have to come down south where the food is in abundance. And most of them came with these agricultural skills, most of them. There were very few, the census mentions most of them as farmers and agriculturists, agricola, as such.
All right, all right.
To add a little thing, this was not the case with the what we call Saraswat, and I would like to put a word on that, because that Saraswat identity is a created identity. It is not a real identity, and this identity was created only around the 16th century. The Brahmins who had come, they didn't go into agriculture because the Portuguese laws made it such that the Gaonkaris came in pristine hands, and so those who didn't convert took up other professions: finance, business, trade. And that is why they dominated trade, and you see all the great bankers of Canada are all from these communities.
Communities, exactly.
Well, we are not there. We are in agriculture. And
yes, yes. Thank you.
And Alan, just to follow up on that, why did they choose? Was there a geographical reason or something else that this settlement kind of focused on South Canada, or were they invited by kind of rulers there? How did that connection happen as such?
No, there was no invitation. You see, some went from Bardez, they went into neighboring parts of Karnataka, and there's still a community there. And a study has been done by the Xavier Institute in Porwari about these people, and they are called Bardezkars. Now, the reason why you came south is very simple. You could not go north because you had the Marathas taking over the province of the north there. There's only that south. And there were these fortresses that were there, which were taken by Shivappa Nayaka, captured back from them around 1658. But from about 1671, when the Somshekara Nayaka was assassinated, the Portuguese were able to get a small presence once again, but not allowed to build forts. But they had a factory, and that is where Rosario Cathedral now is. That is where the new factory came. The earlier establishment, a small fort, was in Bolar, that was South Sebastio, and I've got some beautiful pictures of that still, of the place now. I mean, it's just. But the factory came up on this side of Rosario, built, and which was taken over by Hyder Ali in around 1770.
Okay. So just to summarize where we are for the attendees. So we started off with talking about the general migration of our long, really long ancestors into Goa over the course of many thousands of years. And then we talked a little bit about the Portuguese period, which started in 1510 and led to a migration at some point starting in the 1540s. The major migration to Mangalore, as I understand from this was the 1650s to the 1650s to the 1750s. Is that about right? So that's where we are at this point in time. The population of the community in Mangalore is about 50,000. And then we enter a phase where we're forced to move again. So maybe Alan, you want to pick up on 1784. What is the political backdrop at that time? What is the military backdrop, and kind of what happened at that time?
Can I just interject and say that most people's conception of Goa in the time, the early centuries of Portuguese rule here was that it was what it is today. But in fact, it was a very, very tiny part of a few hundred square kilometers compared to 4,000 square kilometers today. So most of these migrations happened from the coastal areas of Bardes, Tiswadi, Salset, and a few islands that were near these, within, let's say, a 10-kilometer distance from the coast. So the Goa of today and the Goa of the time of these migrations, when some of the ancestors of people in Mangalore came from, are very, very different. And secondly, there was also a concomitant migration from Goa of a lot of Hindu families. In fact, I have quite a few friends here in Goa whose families go back to those days of migration, and they are returning to Goa. They kept more in touch with their temples. They had the religious affiliation, the temples in these areas that they maintain till today. So there's a concomitant migration of Hindu people out of Goa from these same areas for probably the same reasons.
You're correct, Desmond, you're correct. The only thing I would like to say is, instead of saying Hindu, I would like to say Konkani Brahmins, more or less, because that gives a more accurate kind of description, classification, because the word Hindu at that time was still not there. And I keep re-emphasizing this point because otherwise it gives a distorted view of our histories. Now, there is a census regarding the number of Konkani Brahmins and number of Konkani Christians that came from the thing. There is a census which was made by the English, a gentleman called Buchanan, under the when Canada came under the British. That was done in 1801, and it's accessible. You can download it also. And this census gives certain figures. There were around 13,000 Konkani Brahmins in Canada in 1784, and Christians. But the Christians had suffered a horrendous loss in the captivity. I'll come to that in a moment. I use these figures to work backwards from these figures, taking to about, say, about 1560 or so, which is not very correct. You've got to do this with a lot more care. But roughly, what it tells me is altogether about 2,000 Konkani Brahmins, individuals, left Goa, that includes families as such, and came to Canada. Many more, a few more went down to Cochin and to other places. That is only the number, and that has grown to this number of 13,000. In comparison, when you work back with Christian figures, they come to about at least 2 to 3 times more than here. So more number of Christians left Goa, which was a Christian place as such, and they came down here.
And just a little mathematical point that I think Michael Lobo will agree perhaps is that in terms of numbers, these numbers look very small, but in terms of percentage, it was a fairly large number of the population in these areas at that time. I mean, a shocking figure for me is that Bombay, for example, had 100,000 people in the year 1900. And of them, 10% were Parsi. So similarly, Goa had, X number, Mangalore had X number, but the percentages were more important than the absolute numbers.
Yeah, you're right. Because Goan population at that time, the estimate, as I said, the Christian population would have been just about 180,000 to about 2 lakhs or so. Okay, but these statistics are very, very unreliable. Let's put it that way, because nobody sat and counted. These are just estimates from different people. So you get very different numbers, and you can only make a rough estimate. Sir.
Let me ask Maxwell, you would put your hand up to either ask something or say something.
Yes, yes. I have a question to Alan. This is about the migration to Goa, not migration out of Goa. It was a common migration for what you call the Gaud Saraswat Brahmins. Because all who came into Goa were that category, the Konkani Brahmins, you may call it, or mainly this is the, when they came into Goa, from where did they come? What is the route they took? You know, there are different opinions. They call us practically, our language is very, very close to Bengali. And we are supposed to have come from the Tirhut division of Bihar. Does anyone, Alan, can you enlarge on this?
Yes, certainly. Now what you're talking, Maxwell, is what I talked about having to rewrite history. What you're talking is the traditions, because this history that you're referring to is written by Brahmins. You see, and we have not read the history of other peoples, the Bandaris, the Kunubis, the Gaudis, the Chordos. We have not read those histories at all because they're not available, the Sudras. And these are coming out now. There was a Goan gentleman who had died recently. He's called Wag. And he wrote a set of poems called the Song of the Sudhir, and that was strongly resented and opposed to by the Brahmin sides, you know. So there is a lot of work going on there, and which shows the rage of the people who could not come in there. Now, coming to this question that you mentioned, the Brahmin family is coming from Tirut. Yes, the thing is, when Goa came under different rulers, the Brahmins were brought in as, you know, because they were the literate class, as legitimizers. You know, they control the religion. So they legitimized these rules. They kept accounts. They did the administrative work. They were the diplomats. They were the linguists, as such. So, and they came in from different times. So when you talk about Tirut, this is probably go back to the time of the Mauryas, because Goa was once under the Mauryas. Then you have a time, there is a study that has been made by a gentleman called Mascarenhas, who lives somewhere in the US. And this was a study of the Lothali Brahmins. And their DNA comes from Saurashtra. And they are not related to the Saraswats of Punjab, but to the Khatris of Saurashtra, more than that. Then there is a family that came from Panikubja, there is Sharmas. This is from Kudwa's book. So what you see here, and then of course there is a little bit, let's say, from Kashmir, you know, because some hymns are there. So what you see here, and what I see, is that small groups came from different regions. And in Goa, they never identified themselves as Saraswats. No Portuguese literature refers to them as Saraswats. That name has been created later. And this was done, there's a beautiful thesis written by a lady, Urmila Patil, who studied got a doctorate from Texas University, you know, in Austin, University of Austin. And I can make this available because it's there online. And she explains how this happened when our expelled Goan Brahmins reached the Peshwa's court in Pune. They were faced fierce rivalry from three different Brahmin groups, which were Dravida Brahmins, Chitpavans, the Karadas, and the Deshastas. And to gain a status there, they had to build up a tradition and saying that they were northern Brahmins. That's why they're called Gauda Brahmins. And that Gauda has been confused with the kingdom of Gauda in Bengal. There's no relation to them at all. And then these stories were built up into what was called as Haidri Kanda. And the person who investigated and put these together was Gerson Darukuna in Bombay. And these were put together and then incorporated into the Skanda Purana, and very beautifully put that this is part of this particular chapter of the Skanda Purana. So it gave it a certain legitimacy, saying that this is an old Purana, which was not. It was recent. So as I come back to this again, and this I'll be coming out with a further book after the one I complete on the Inquisition, in which it is very clearly that this was a created tradition, which will be opposed. I know that people will come up with a lot of things, but in history, you got to give evidence. Give your evidence.
Are you suggesting that what is being touted as that we all were Saraswat Brahmins? So the migration to Goa was not only Saraswat Brahmins, but there were Khatris, there were other denominations. And are you suggesting that? So all of us...
I'm not suggesting that, Maxwell. This is the evidence that is there. The genetics.
No, whatever evidence is there, but what I'm saying is our belief that we are all Saraswat Brahmins could be flawed.
Agreed. Until you do your DNA and other things, it is difficult to know. What I believe is that these groups came in, and then the Brahmin groups, there is evidence for that, intermarried with certain local groups. And these local groups would have been those who would have been controlling, I presume this is my hypothesis, would have been controlling the Gaonkari lands. And through these intermarriages, we also became Brahmins. For instance, mine is J2. J2 comes from the Zargos Mountains via Harappa. It is not a Brahmin, this one. But I call myself a Saraswat Brahmin. That is because of intermarriage at some stage in our history. So this is a new chapter that has to be written. It is not, I have not seen much literature on that, but the genetics is throwing this entire subject open. And I think in a few years' time, we will have a much clearer picture, and which will be disputed by traditional sources.
There is another angle that I have to talk. If you talk to the GSBs, they will very clearly, very lucidly tell you that they are the product of Parashurams, who is an avatar of Vishnu. Parashurams, having brought them to the Singh and throwing his axe into the sea to reclaim the land, the Gomantak land. And they believe that Parashuram, who was absolutely against the Kshatriyas, he was dead against, the Kshatriya clan. And that is why he made all the kings on the west coast from the families that he brought. There are versions where he brought 12 families first. Then there is a version of 64, and these are names given where he settled each one of them. This is all available, and ultimately, this is the tradition of the GSBs that we talk of, and we are common, migrations. These are all common beliefs, as you said, might have been written by the Brahmins only to favor them. And this is the traditional belief which is there.
Exactly. That is a tradition, and it has been a created tradition. Now you call, on the west coast, you have Parashurama. On the east coast, in Tamil Nadu, you have Agastya, who was another one of the rishis.
Correct.
Rishis.
Correct.
Yeah. So, and what you get is, you have to create an identity to establish yourself. And that is why it is so important to know who we are and who we were. If you don't know who we were, we don't know who we are. And we don't have an identity. That is why, and that identity should be based on historical fact. That is my view. There must be evidence. When did Parashurama live?
Let me just interject here, because I think we're getting digressed on this topic. There are a lot of interesting questions on Konkani, on the language, and maybe some of the themes I'm looking at are kind of, were people already speaking Konkani at that point, which I believe they were. Maybe we spend 5 minutes just talking about the origins of the language and why it's different in certain parts. And then let's move quickly to the captivity, because I think we'll probably run out of time pretty soon.
You would like me to give my views, or anybody else?
Yeah, go ahead. I think anyone on the panel, I guess the basic question is, at what point did people start speaking Konkani, which I presume was a very long time ago, but maybe I'm wrong on that.
Well, there's just one comment I'd like to make, which is that in the course of doing the shooting and research for our Souls and Spices film, my partner Christopher Ego and myself found Konkani speaking people all the way down the coast of Kerala. In fact, there were up to about 300,000 or 400,000 of them who spoke a mixture of Konkani and Malayalam. So obviously the Konkan coast as a linguistic entity goes up and north of Goa and all the way down south. So it might have something to do with migrations, but Konkani is of course hugely influenced by Hindi and Marathi and so on. But Konkani speaking is a fairly large, geographical area. Konkani speaking people cover.
Okay, so maybe that's a topic for a different webinar. I mean, is it fair to say, just to answer a couple of the questions, is it fair to say that by the time essentially this community was speaking Konkani much before the migration to Canada, right? That would be
definitely.
If I may add,
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Maxwell.
If I may add, if you study the languages, Nepali, Bengali, and Konkani practically have got so many same words. Like to sit, we say bos. In Bengali, it is boshon. And, likewise, similarity is there. And I never thought this would come. Otherwise, I have material on this. Some future seminar we can discuss. But these are all Sanskrit-based languages.
Okay, so it's a language from antiquity, essentially.
Antiquity. It is all Sanskrit-based. There is absolutely, and each area they went into, they developed into independent languages or versions. Like Konkani also, they must have come here as Konkani had developed. But then later Konkani, according to places they visited, and the local influences, like Mangalore is totally Kannada-based.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody asked a question, why is we are called the Canara coast? It is the Portuguese who called the local language, the kings, as Canara kings. In fact, the Chautas, who were then in power, and they called the Canara king. Canara is a corrupted version of the Portuguese of Kannada. The entire Karnataka, or it's from Kannada. They were all Kannada kings. Vijayanagar was a Kannada king, and Kadambas were Kannada kings. If you go, that is the local influence. The Portuguese called the region as Canara. From Canada was for them the language.
Okay, that's very interesting.
Half a minute.
30 seconds. Yeah, 30 seconds.
All I'd like to say is that Konkani is a multi-layered language. It has got many layers, and its origins go back to hunter-gatherer times, which is much more than 10,000 years back. And the most recent, there's a Dravidian layer, and this most recent is the so-called Sanskrit layer, because of the dominant this one. Okay, but that we'll discuss some other time.
And Alan, you wanted this thing. You were talking about the surnames. How most of the surnames were given by the priests when they baptized the converts, and most of the surnames were given their own surname by the priests. So there are, against every surname there is. According to, there is a Dakshinotter Saraswat book by Mr. K.N. Kudwa. He was an ICS officer. And his book, which I have a copy of, that very clearly states which families went into which surname, the Christians that converted.
Yeah, I think our surnames that's very interesting, Maxwell. And I think I personally have my own questions on our surnames and probably requires a pretty in-depth view. Maybe yes. Michael has done a lot of work on our genealogy.
Yes.
So maybe, Michael,
yes.
do you want to spend a minute or two talking about some of the sources of our surnames? While we're waiting for that, let's shift gears and move our history forward a little bit into the 1784 to 1799 phase. And Alan, since you're the one whose technology is working at the moment, do you want to spend a minute talking about how that period came about? What was the kind of political backdrop? What happened, and how we eventually came back? I know that's a lot to pack in 2 or 3 minutes. We're already running about 90 minutes. I think if there's some flexibility in the panel, we're happy to continue as long as Riju is okay. But
yeah, we'll just get Michael back and we'll get him to talk about genealogy. And in that time, we'll just go to Q&As from the panelists. And there are some Q&As in YouTube as well. Kitu, I'll send those links to you.
There's a lot of questions. We're not, I think we'll have to compartmentalize this into 7 different webinars to get all of those done. But Alan, why don't we talk about the captivity phase?
Captivity. Yeah, briefly, what happened was after the war with the company, peace was in 1784 in Mangalore, and after this was when all the Christians captive. Now there are a number of different theories on this, and again we need another half a dozen webinars to discuss this. But my own view is that it was nothing to do with any religious aspect or bigotry or anything from Tipu, but it was a very clear political consideration in his effort to legitimize his rule and to show that his authority came from, and his attitude, he equated Europeans who were his main enemy as Nasrani, and these Nasranis he equated as Christians, Kiristan. And he took all the people captive, about 33,000 as per my estimate from Canada, about 7,000 escaped out of the 40,000. And he took them to Sringapatna, but he also took an equal number practically from Mysore and from Tamil Nadu, because these were the local Christians. They're not from Goan origin, but local Christians who had been converted over time by the Jesuits and others. And so altogether, roughly about 60,000 or so would have been the captives, but only about half of them came from Canada as such. And finally, one major escape happened on the night of 6th February 1792, when the Cornwallis's army bisected Sringapatna. And these people went to Virajpet, about 700 individuals with their families, and they were part of the slave battalions of Tipu, young boys who had been circumcised and made into military slaves. And they had escaped, and these records at Virajpet are still available. There are baptism records there with photographs, and I wish that the community can digitize them. Somebody takes the initiative and we digitize them and keep it as a permanent record. Then finally in 1799, on 4th May, Tipu was defeated by the British, and that's when the rest of the people came. My estimate is maybe about, finally, we had only about 40,000 to 50,000. I mean, about 50% of the population was, more than 50% was lost. More than 50%.
Over that 15-year period.
Yes.
Okay, I have a quick question, Alan. In the process of deportation, we have the Saldanas and the Kutinos of Umzur who have been spared because they were the growers of pan and supari. Is that true? Or we have the proof regarding that?
There are family traditions, no proofs. But there is also a similar tradition which says the Bragas were also of Umzur were spared because of their growing pan. But I found in this document, in this baptism records at Virajpet, the name Manuel Braga, and Manuel Braga probably is one of my, I think, because my ancestor, the only one who returned, married a Rosa Braga, and for this I am grateful to Michael because he pointed that out, and I could not find that document when I went to Umzur Church. So fortunately, he has this on record.
So on this point, Kitu, we can just ask Michael to talk about the genealogy work he's done, and then we can go to the Q&As. Michael, if you could briefly talk about your genealogy work, how you've gone about it, and where are you right now on the genealogy work? And if some of the panelists here or the attendees here want to get in touch with you and get in their genealogy from the work you've done, how can they get in touch with you?
I'm not sure whether we have enough time in this webinar to go into that subject now, but let's put it this way. Our history goes back centuries. As Maxwell said, we start from the Saraswati era in which our ancient ancestors migrated from the Saraswati River Valley. One branch came to Goa, another went to Bengal, and that's how the languages are connected. And then in Goa, in the 16th century, they were converted by Portuguese missionaries. The next step was the migration to Canada, to different parts. They came by boat. And finally, in the 18th century, when they had made Canada their home, when our customs started to develop, we had the shock of the invasion of Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan. They were absolute foreigners, even more foreign than the Europeans. So whatever the Mangalore natives felt about whether they preferred to be under the Portuguese or the British or Tipu, it was their choice. We shouldn't take the stand that just because Tipu was Indian and we were Indian, it was our duty to support Tipu against the others. There's no truth whatsoever in that logic. There was no India. Our country was just Canada. And so whatever the Mangalorean Catholics decided that they preferred, it was their choice. Tipu didn't give them that choice. As soon as he was victorious in battle, he took the whole lot by force and imprisoned them in Srirangapatna. And only after they were released in 1799, the modern phase of our history began. And since you speak about genealogy, that's as far back as we can go, because it's from that point onwards that records have been kept in the major churches of Mangalore, in Rosario Cathedral, which you can see in the background, although the church you see in the background was not built in 1800. That's more modern, about 100 years ago. It was an older church earlier. So likewise with Mangalore, but they have kept records, fortunately, going back 200 years in these two old churches. And my research started with the very old records in Rosario Cathedral and in Milagros Church. They were written in Old Latin and Portuguese. I was able to translate them. And then my work took off from there. But we have to accept the fact that from a genealogical point of view, we can't go back more than 200 years. We know that our ancestors came from Goa, but we can't trace our ancestry back to the ancestor who migrated. That's too far back. There are no authentic records. And very few families have some idea as to where they came from.
We are from.
That's about it. There's no proof from church records, but at least fortunately we can go back 200 years from the records that have been maintained in the cathedral and in Milagros. And in this respect, we are far more fortunate than those of other religions. I don't think Hindus, for example, their temples have not maintained records more than 100 years at best. But we have, and we are able to document our genealogy. I'll just make one more point since I'm on the... Alan Machado was saying that Hindu is a recent word. That isn't quite true. It's an old word, but it was in more than over 100 years ago. It did not refer to religion. A Hindu simply meant an Indian, a person living on this side of the Indus River. There were different words for the Hindu religion. When the Hindu newspaper was founded in 1878, it simply meant a citizen of India. It was not a reference to the Hindu religion, and that is true presumably even today. When we have the newspaper, the Hindu, it doesn't mean the Hindu religion. So that's one sense in which the old meaning of the word has persisted to the present day. But 100 years ago, there were different words for Hindus. But to come back to genealogy, the other religions are not as fortunate as Christians, because Christians we have kept our records in the churches, in most of them anyway, not all, because many records have been destroyed because of various reasons, whether termites, etc. But for my work, whatever was available, I have made use of. And so now my encyclopedia covering the entire community is about 10,000 pages. I'm trying to finalize it and make it available to all interested persons in about a year from now. It will have to be an internet website because it's now far too large to bring out in printed form. Earlier, it was my dream to bring it out in book form, but one has to be realistic. Books don't sell these days. But I'll make the work available. Everyone has been asking, so that will be done. I could answer some questions on our older history also, but since we've had so many expert opinions and as time is running short, perhaps I'd better stop at this since genealogy is my field of expertise. But if you have any specific questions, I'll be happy.
Michael, I just have one question. Yes. I'm just curious to know what compelled you to get into genealogy, because knowing you as a mathematician back from UK, so what compelled you to take up genealogy?
Well, that goes partly into personal reasons. I had to return to Mangalore. There was illness in the family, so I had to be here. And then to pass the time, I was visiting the churches. I found a very old record, a birth record written in Old Portuguese of my great-grandfather, Anthony Peter Lobo. And he was the son of Lawrence Lobo Prabhu, who was the donor of the site of St. Aloysius College, a very eminent person of his time. So that record intrigued me. I wish I had brought it here. I could have shown it on the screen with the translation, but you get the idea. So my work took off from there. I initially wrote a book on all the descendants of Lawrence Lobo Prabhu. And then people saw me in the churches. They wanted me to help them with their own genealogy. And in any case, we are all one unit really, because nobody belongs to one family alone. My father is a Lobo, my mother is a Fernandez, and all of us, our father may belong to one family, our mother to another, our paternal grandmother to a third, a maternal grandmother to a fourth. And with each generation, the number of families from which we descend will double. By the time we go up 6 generations, we'll be descending from 64 different families. So we'll need 64 different tables just for our own reference. And then, of course, since our aunts and uncles will be marrying into other families, so ideally, any Mangalorean really ought to have the entire encyclopedia to be able to research all his or her various relations, which will soon run into the thousands, even when you go 3 degrees away. Now with the advent of DNA, it's become extra fascinating because it's interesting. People contact me because they discover that through DNA, they are linked to various people whom they never even heard of. And so they come to me and I try to help them to see how specifically I can trace the exact relationship. It's not always easy because the DNA results are not 100% accurate. There are so many different factors to consider. There are maybe common DNA links that come down from very distant ancestors. So by and large, the DNA results tend to suggest a closer relationship than what is actually true. That I found out. I had a couple of friends, Mr. Frank and his wife, Michelle Gonzalez, in the US. They said that their DNA tests show that they were second cousins. But in fact, they're not even third cousins. They are fourth cousins in 2 different ways. So I don't know how the DNA went wrong, but there could be so many reasons. But I'm a genealogist, not a DNA specialist. I mean, so I'm not able to exactly explain how that happens. You want to ask a question, Denzel?
Yeah. No. My point is, going back these 200 odd years, well, when there was a nucleus of a new Mangalorean Catholic community that was survivors from the captivity stage, that became the basis of all current Mangaloreans for the most part, let's say. So we are talking about maybe, what did you say, about 5,000 or 10,000 people who survived and came back?
Descend from the roughly 15,000 persons returned from the captivity.
Okay, so 15,000 persons would represent, let's say, 3,000 or 4,000 families. That's it, right? And from there, most current Mangaloreans can take their
descend from that number.
Yeah, so it's like an inverted pyramid now. If you go backwards from it looks like it's expanding, but then it converges and comes to a base of these families.
It will expand. The generation in the old days, families had about 10 children. It was almost an average number.
Okay.
So now there must be 1 million.
Yeah. So
especially the wealthier people tended to have more.
So just 1,500 families, and I'm assuming each one had 10 kids. That's it.
In 200 years, we are over 1 million.
Yeah.
And so it's an interesting history that we have, both before the captivity and after. Maxwell, PEREIRA, and Alan are the specialists in the pre-captivity history. And I too have done some amount of study, probably not as detailed as they have, but I have written a little history going back over all our various eras and my own thoughts on it. I'll mention just one thought on the captivity, for example. I compared Mangalore as it was in the late 18th century to Kuwait as it is now. Mangalore was a little independent country. It made its wealth by the export of its agricultural produce. It was not a part of a bigger nation. By Mangalore, I mean South Canara. So the invasion of Mangalore by Hyder and Tipu was something like the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, by Saddam Hussein into Iraq. He just came and invaded. He had no right. Likewise, Tipu had no right to invade Mangalore if you go by current standards. You can't say that because Tipu was an Indian, he had the right to invade Mangalore. They were two separate countries. And Mangaloreans had every right to protest. When Kuwait was invaded by Iraq, it resulted in the Gulf War. And definitely the Kuwaitis were on the side of America and the Allies. And they were victorious. Now let's suppose that 200 years from now, we have a new country. Let's call it the United Arab States, in which Iraq, Iran, all the Arab countries and Kuwait become one country. 200 years from now, the historians will say, Saddam Hussein was one of our pioneering patriots. He invaded Kuwait to try and make us one country. The Kuwaitis were traitors. They resisted Saddam Hussein. So would you call that logic? So how can you say the Mangaloreans were traitors because they resisted Tipu? He was a foreigner. He had a different religion. He forced us into a different culture. We were much more European in our attitude because we were governed by the British and the Portuguese, until at least the Portuguese. We were technically under Hindu rulers, but the Christians in 18th century Mangalore were governed by their Portuguese priests and not by the Hindu rulers. The Portuguese had the power to administer their own flock. The Hindus might have been technically rulers or rajas, but they allowed the Christians to live their own lives until everything changed after the invasion by Hyder and Tipu. So that's a personal opinion that I've stated in my own history, but I agree that it's not quite my area of specialization. I've not studied it to the same depth as Alan has, and my specialization is the post-captivity era, where I can study genealogy, and I've written a detailed history of 200 years of the post-captivity year by year, which I published in a book 20 years ago during the bicentennial. That book is still available, but it has been read by very few people. It was to have been nominated for the Sahitya Academy Award by my friend, Professor Bennett Pinto. He wanted to nominate it as an ideal work for a local history. He suddenly passed away. And after that, he had an unfinished book on the musicians of Mangalore, which I finished for him after he died in 2003. And then I became the editor of the Mangalore magazine, and that book was forgotten. And even my genealogy, I had to keep it on hold for many years as I went into other writings. I've written other books on the history of popular Western music, on chess, and various other books. But now I've got back to genealogy in recent years. I've gone to all the distant churches. Whatever was available, I've translated from the old Portuguese. And so now the work is almost complete. It's 10,000 pages. I'll put it together in the course of the next 1 year, and we'll try and make it available. Luckily, I have an expert in Vijay who probably will help me to bring it out on a website. And then we'll take it from there. Let's hope it will be accessible to all who are interested. I would like it to make everyone, to make it accessible to all.
Yeah, we'd like to see it too, Michael, soon.
Mm-hmm.
So let me, I think we're going to close pretty soon. Let me actually open up to the panel, Desmond, Mona, Maxwell. Any kind of closing thoughts or questions for anyone else? Would welcome that now. And yeah, go ahead, Maxwell, if you want to start.
Yeah, if I may elaborate slightly on the Hindu identity. As Michael pointed out, it was the river Indus that was known to the world. And you'd be surprised, I don't know how many people know this, but India as a country has been spoken of also in the Bible. I don't think many people know about it. And it was the 12th region under King Assyrius, and the Hindu identity was for river Indus. And from there, the first time Hindu as a religion came in for the first census of India. Till then, Hindu was just an Indian's identity. But as a religion, it came because the British wanted to check what amount of proselytization they had done, and they could identify the Muslims. There were only 3 categories. They couldn't decide the others. The Hindus and, the Christians and Muslims, they could identify. The 3rd category, they clubbed together as Hindus. And that's where the religious aspect of the Hindus came in. That is the first time the Hindu religion was spoken of. Before that, there were Jains, there were Vaishnavites, there were Shaivites, there were plethora of religions, each one following there was a string, common string, like the 90% of that's why they talked of the 33,000 crores of, the pantheon of Hindu gods. Because everyone started their own god, and they saw God in animate, inanimate, element, everything, every aspect of life. Whatever they saw, they started worshipping. They started worshipping also like Shani god. Shani is bad luck. And everything they assimilated into the planets and things like that. But for the first time, that's when I wrote that article, I'm a Hindu. And it is elaborated by another article which I wrote in the Times of India about the origin of the Hindu religion. The Hindus should thank the British. They managed to unite the whole country under one name.
Right, Maxwell, that'll be another webinar. So let's pause it there. Maybe Desmond, I'll open it to you to kind of...
Just 2 points. One is when the Portuguese landed up in India in the form of Vasco da Gama in his early voyages, when talking to Indo-Portuguese historians, what came out was the Portuguese had absolutely meager ideas about anyone who was non-Muslim and non-Christian. And Christian for them meant Catholic at that point. In fact, there's a hilarious story of them landing up in a temple during the first landing and finding, they were looking for a mythological Christian king of the East called Prester John, who had huge armies and enormous wealth, and they wanted to combine with Prester John and go and release Jerusalem from the Muslims. And that was part of the souls and spices thing. Now, they thought this particular version of a Hindu goddess was actually a version of Virgin Mary, and they bowed down and gave their respects to this Hindu goddess statue. So that's the kind of ignorance that was at play back in those days. So that's one point, which I think is worth going into at some other in some other session. But the modern history of Mangaloreans actually starts at the point, I think, from when captivity ended and this British era started. If you look at all the names that we see here, our surnames may come from the Latin names that the Portuguese gave, but the modern names are all British, Anglicizations. So I think this era requires a further in-depth look to see how the identity of Mangaloreans got shaped by British rather than by the Portuguese. Portuguese is going back, and going back before that was Hindu, right? But the modern era is largely British dominated, I think, and influenced.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's interesting. Mona, anything from your end?
Yeah, all right. As Desmond told about the names, not the surnames, but the initial names which are influenced by the British, I have something to say here. As far as the Christian names have been evolved, I could categorize them into three sections. One is names prior to 1930, after 1930, and during 1960s and 70s. So looking at the Christian name before 1930, it was more of biblical names and saints and, but still the Mangalorean Christians managed to have some kind of local flavor attached to it. The Konkanicization, it's there in a few of the books. The Alfred remained to be Alpi, and Teresa was Teju. These kind of local names, what they used to give, in spite of having westernized names. This was prior to 1930. Later on, we find that with the advent of nationalism, with Gandhiji in the main picture, Mangaloreans getting kind of detached from these Western names and getting more into Indian names, sort of Rajiv, Sanjeev, Manohar, Jawahar, and sort of thing. And the whole concept got erased after the Gulf boom, the migration, say, to other countries in search of occupation. And that's another phase where the Indian names pertaining to Mangalorean Catholic names got changed. So that's the process of evolution of Mangalorean Catholic names in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Mona. It is something that I've found curious as well. Going back to my own family and names in my parents' generation, very Western. And then in my generation, it's quite a mix. So definitely something we need to pick up again. Okay, maybe to close it out, Viju will close, but maybe Alan, we should come back to you for any kind of final thoughts on things we've talked about today, and maybe what we might do in terms of something for the future.
Well, I think, on such a vast subject and range of subjects, there's always going to be different opinions, and this is welcome. The only thing is we need to put this together and get it. So what I chat with Vijay a little earlier, if we can sort of make this available on the net, so that we can draw in a lot more participation, and then sort of heal this up, bring it out together, because there are so many things to discuss on Konkani and other things, and we need to bring in linguists and other experts into the line. There's a lot of work done on linguism also, on linguistics also. There are people like experts at Southworth and Whitstable in Harvard and there. And you see, we need to think of that not just from tradition. So being history is a little, takes into consideration tradition as well. But we need to have this, and personal feelings, don't really have much in this, it must be based on evidence-based. And I think we can take this further with a few more of these webinars on particular subjects, now that we talked about broad aspect, and then bring it out in some version on the net where it can be taken further and eventually build up a huge sort of thing on our culture, our religion, and so many other aspects of Mangalorean Christians.
Okay, I'll hand it back to Viju, but maybe I'll just say a couple of words from my side in terms of why we came here. And it's right to say there's been, there's a lot of history that I think if people are interested, we'll have to dig through in very specific webinars. But on a personal front, I wasn't even aware of, I'd say, even the basics of our community history, and not even some of the more in-depth questions that have been asked here today. And it was just not spoken much in my family. I don't know if that's a consistent theme across others. That's kind of where we started, and hopefully I've learned a lot over the last year. Hopefully we can continue that tradition and make sure people are kind of proud Mangaloreans, proud Indians as well. So that's a little bit of a thought. So let me hand it back to Viju for closing comments, some housekeeping in terms of video recordings, links. And to the extent people have suggestions on what we want to do next, we'd be happy to take them. There's a lot of questions that have remained unanswered. We'll compile them. That'll give us some ideas for future webinars, and we'll try to get back to individuals whenever we can.
So First of all, I again thank everyone. Thank Michael, Alan, Desmond, Mona, Maxwell for taking the time to agreeing to be on this webinar. Kitu and I were trying to, didn't know if it worked, and we didn't know if it was a good idea. Our intention is still the same, that we want to know our culture. We want to understand our culture. We want to understand our history. I grew up in Mangalore, and I was there 23 years before I, went to different parts of the world. But I learned history of the country, I have a history of the world, but I didn't take any time, nor did my parents take any time to know my own history. I've not visited where, if somebody asked me when I was there, where was your great-grandfather's place? Where did he move from? What did he do? I didn't know about it. So even I didn't know about the different, the churches, how old are they? Why were they built, and who had built them? Or even my culture, we have a rose in front of before our weddings. Why did that culture come from? The food culture. Why is my Konkani accent different from the Konkani accent of the GSPs or the Goans? I don't know that. I still don't know that. So this was the intention, that we know a little more about ourselves. And that is the intention for this webinar. I appreciate every single attendee who's taken their time today, to join this webinar. I and Kitu would take time to go all over the questions that have come on this Q&A, the chat, and even on the YouTube channel. And then we'll summarize the most, the asked about topic. We'll discuss with the current experts here or the other experts out there, and then, make the subsequent webinars. I would request, Desmond has a lot more expertise in film and production. So the video that he's made, we would try to bring it up in the YouTube channel as well. So thank you, Mona. Thank you, Maxwell, Kitu, Michael, and thank all the attendees. I hope you have a nice weekend. Thanks, that's it.
Yeah, thanks very much, everyone. This was a great first start. I think we covered more than we thought we would. But clearly we'll need to focus a few topics and come back to a broader group. So we'll look forward to doing that. But really a personal thanks to all the panelists here. Viju and I are just moderating, but all of you have specific expertise that you're bringing in. That's very interesting to learn.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I will be talking to my cousin Christopher Rego about whether we can do something with the 69-minute video that looked at 500 odd years of Indo-Portuguese story. It was a teaser that we meant to turn into a TV series, and it actually translated into something else. But let's see if he agrees, and if possible, we'd like to put it up.
Thank you, Alan. Yeah. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, Keith, one just final thing. Yeah, thank you so much for having me, especially because this was such a super excited session. In fact, a lot of learning. And more than a webinar, it's community coming together, which is very important right now. So thank you for the platform.